Nobody inside the grocery store paid much attention to the plus-size cashier. She smiled at every customer, scanned groceries with quiet efficiency, and thanked each person before they left. To most people, Evelyn Harper was simply another ordinary woman working an ordinary job. That included Alessandro Moretti. Every Thursday afternoon, the powerful businessman stopped by the same neighborhood store during a break between private meetings. While paying for a few items, he casually switched to Italian and continued a confidential conversation with the man beside him. He never lowered his voice. He never looked around. Why would he? In his experience, nobody standing behind a cash register had any reason to understand one of the oldest Sicilian dialects. Smiling to himself, Alessandro made a quiet joke about the chubby cashier, certain she would never know. Evelyn simply finished scanning the last item. Then, without raising her voice, she answered him in flawless Italian. The smile disappeared from Alessandro's face, because in that single moment, someone inside the store had just exposed a secret that could destroy his entire empire. Thursday mornings always arrived quietly at Maplewood Market. By 8 o'clock, the small neighborhood grocery store had already settled into its familiar rhythm. Shopping carts rattled across polished floors. Fresh bread filled the air with a comforting aroma. Retirees compared prices in the produce section, while young parents hurried through the aisles, balancing grocery lists with restless children. Standing behind Register 3, Evelyn Harper greeted every customer with the same warm smile. "Good morning. Did you find everything you needed today? Have a wonderful afternoon." She repeated those simple phrases hundreds of times each week, never sounding impatient, even when others did. To nearly everyone who entered the store, Evelyn was forgettable. People noticed her name tag only long enough to read it before looking away. Some remembered her because she always smiled. Others remembered only that she was the plus-size cashier who seemed too cheerful for someone working an ordinary job. Very few ever wondered who she had been before standing behind that register. An elderly gentleman placed a basket of fruit on the conveyor belt. "You always pack the peaches carefully," he said with a grateful smile. "My wife appreciates that." Evelyn smiled back. "Then I'll make sure today's are perfect too." She gently separated the peaches from the heavier canned goods before placing everything into reusable bags. It took only a few extra seconds. Most cashiers wouldn't have bothered. Evelyn always did. Not every customer was as kind. Just before lunchtime, a sharply dressed woman glanced impatiently at the line before looking directly at Evelyn. "Could they put someone faster on this register?" she muttered loudly enough for several people nearby to hear. Another customer chuckled. "I guess she's moving as fast as she can." Neither bothered lowering their voices. Evelyn heard every word. She simply continued scanning each item at the same steady pace. Years ago, comments like those had followed her home. Now they rarely reached her heart. Her grandmother had once told her something she never forgot. People reveal themselves much faster than they reveal the truth about you. Back then, Evelyn hadn't fully understood those words. After years of watching strangers make instant judgments based on appearances, she finally did. She finished the transaction, wished the impatient customer a pleasant day, and welcomed the next person in line with the exact same kindness. No resentment. No sarcasm. Just quiet professionalism. Her manager occasionally asked why she never argued with rude customers. Evelyn's answer never changed. "Most people arrive carrying battles we can't see. I don't want to become another one." Few realized how unusual that perspective truly was. Even fewer knew where it came from. Years earlier, Evelyn had lived an entirely different life. Instead of grocery receipts, she had worked with classified documents. Instead of memorizing weekly sale prices, she had memorized regional dialects from across Europe. Languages had fascinated her since childhood. By the time she finished graduate school, she spoke 6 fluently: English, Italian, French, Spanish, German, Russian. Her extraordinary ability eventually led her to contract work, translating sensitive conversations for federal investigations. Accuracy wasn't simply important. Sometimes one misplaced word changed the meaning of an entire operation. One missing verb could redirect months of investigative work. One misunderstood location could place innocent lives at risk. She had built an impressive career before turning 30. Then everything changed with a single phone call. Her grandmother had been diagnosed with a rapidly progressing illness. There were specialists, treatment plans, care facilities, professional caregivers. Everyone advised Evelyn not to interrupt her career. She resigned anyway. For nearly 3 years, she cared for the woman who had raised her after her parents died. When her grandmother peacefully passed away, Evelyn discovered something unexpected. She didn't want another career built around secrets. She didn't want conference rooms, government buildings, security clearances. She wanted something wonderfully ordinary, something where people argued over coupons instead of classified intelligence. That desire eventually brought her to Maplewood Market. Some former colleagues thought she had wasted her talent. Perhaps they were right. Perhaps they weren't. Evelyn had stopped measuring success by titles a long time ago. Just after noon, the automatic doors slid open again. Conversations inside the store softened almost imperceptibly. No one seemed to know exactly why. Some people simply carried an invisible gravity. The man entering the store was one of them. Alessandro Moretti wore a charcoal overcoat despite the mild weather. His appearance was understated, yet impossibly refined. Every movement was calm, deliberate and controlled, as though he had never once needed to rush for anything in his life. The employees recognized him as a regular customer. Always Thursdays. Always around lunchtime. Always purchasing only a handful of items. Imported olive oil, fresh coffee, mineral water, dark chocolate. Nothing unusual. No one knew much else. Some assumed he owned a successful investment company. Others guessed real estate. A few quietly speculated he came from old European money. No one asked. People instinctively respected the boundaries surrounding him. Walking half a step behind Alessandro was another impeccably dressed man. His name, though unknown to everyone inside the store, was Matteo Ricci. He rarely spoke. He observed. His calm expression made him almost invisible, exactly the way he preferred it. Neither man noticed Evelyn. Why would they? To Alessandro, she was simply another cashier working another shift in another neighborhood store. Someone whose face blended into the background of ordinary life. As the two men slowly made their way through the aisles, Evelyn continued helping customers, unaware that within the next few minutes, an ordinary Thursday would quietly begin changing the course of 3 very different lives. Thursday afternoons followed a pattern. After nearly 2 months of working at Maplewood Market, Evelyn had unconsciously memorized it. At exactly 12:20, the lunch rush would begin to fade. Parents hurried home before school pickup. Office workers returned to their desks. The checkout lines grew shorter, and the store settled into a calmer rhythm. Almost without fail, Alessandro Moretti arrived sometime between 12:25 and 12:30. He never seemed rushed. He selected the same imported coffee beans from the top shelf, compared 2 bottles of olive oil with quiet precision, added a bar of dark chocolate to his basket, and finished with sparkling mineral water. It was the routine of a man who valued consistency. Evelyn noticed patterns because languages had taught her to notice everything else. Accents, word choice, pauses. People often believed communication was about speaking. In reality, it was mostly about paying attention. That afternoon, Alessandro wasn't alone. The quiet man who accompanied him remained close enough to speak privately, without appearing suspicious. From where Evelyn stood, they looked like 2 successful businessmen discussing another ordinary workday. Nothing about them invited attention. Nothing needed to. When their turn arrived, Alessandro placed the groceries on the conveyor belt while his companion glanced briefly around the store. Not nervously, habitually. Evelyn greeted them with the same warm smile she offered everyone. "Good afternoon." Alessandro acknowledged her with a brief nod before checking a message on his phone. For several seconds, neither man spoke. The scanner emitted its familiar series of soft beeps. Coffee, olive oil, chocolate, water. Then Alessandro slipped his phone back into his pocket. Without warning, he began speaking in Italian. Not standard Italian. A regional Sicilian dialect. Fast, relaxed. The kind of speech used only between people who trusted one another completely. Evelyn kept scanning groceries. Her expression never changed. Years earlier, one of her instructors had insisted on a simple rule. The best interpreter is the one nobody notices. She had practiced that discipline for years. Listen. Understand. React to nothing. Alessandro spoke first. "The meeting stays at the Harbor District warehouse tomorrow evening." His companion nodded. "I've already informed everyone." Something about the wording immediately caught Evelyn's attention. Not because of what was said, because of how it was answered. She continued placing groceries into reusable bags. Neither man looked at her. Alessandro continued speaking. "I don't want unnecessary visitors this time. Of course, the fewer people who know the location, the better. Naturally." Their voices remained calm, almost conversational. To anyone else nearby, they were simply speaking another language. A young cashier 2 registers away laughed with a customer. Someone dropped a carton of milk in aisle 6. The store's overhead speakers began playing another soft, classic song. Everything around Evelyn remained perfectly ordinary, except the conversation unfolding 3 feet away. As Alessandro reached for his wallet, he smiled faintly. Still speaking Italian, he said something that sounded more amused than cruel. "I wonder if the chubby cashier realizes our coffee costs more than her weekly paycheck." His companion chuckled politely. Evelyn heard every syllable. The words didn't sting. They simply confirmed what years of experience had already taught her. People often became careless when they believed someone was invisible. She finished bagging the groceries exactly as she always did. Heavy items at the bottom, fragile ones on top. Then Alessandro continued. "If anything changes, everyone meets at Pier 12. His companion answered almost immediately. "I'll make sure the men are waiting at Pier 14. The scanner paused in Evelyn's hand, only for a fraction of a second. Then it resumed. Beep beep. 1 bottle of mineral water. Beep. Another. No one else could have noticed the hesitation. But inside Evelyn's mind, every word replayed with perfect clarity. Pier 12. Response. Pier 14. She had spent years identifying inconsistencies hidden inside thousands of conversations. Sometimes they resulted from poor memory. Sometimes careless translation. Sometimes simple misunderstanding. And sometimes people deliberately changed information. She quietly repeated the exchange to herself. Not aloud, only mentally. A habit formed over years of professional work. Original statement. Response. Compare. Analyze. There was no ambiguity. Alessandro had clearly said Pier 12. The other man had confidently repeated Pier 14. Not corrected. Not questioned. Changed. An experienced interpreter learned to distinguish between hearing mistakes and speaking mistakes. This hadn't been either. It had been a substitution. Small. Precise. Intentional. Yet Alessandro showed no sign of noticing. He handed over his credit card while continuing the conversation, as though everything were perfectly normal. Either he hadn't heard the altered response, or he trusted the man beside him so completely that his brain automatically accepted it. Neither explanation comforted Evelyn. She printed the receipt. Your total is $112.40. Alessandro tapped his card against the reader. Approved. As Evelyn placed the receipt into the shopping bag, she considered whether she should say anything. Immediately, she dismissed the thought. It wasn't her business. She had left a career built on other people's secrets because she no longer wanted to carry them. Whatever these two men discussed had nothing to do with her, or so she believed. Alessandro accepted the bags before glancing at Evelyn for the first time since reaching the register. Perhaps it was the calm expression on her face. Perhaps it was simple curiosity. Whatever the reason, an amused smile crossed his face. Still speaking Italian, he asked casually, "I don't suppose you understood any of that?" The question hung comfortably in the air. His companion smiled as well. They both expected silence. After all, to them, she was only a grocery store cashier. An ordinary woman standing behind an ordinary register. Evelyn looked at him with the same gentle smile she had worn all afternoon. Then she took a slow breath and answered him in flawless Sicilian Italian. For several long seconds, neither man spoke. The familiar sounds of the grocery store continued around them. A child laughed somewhere near the bakery. A shopping cart rolled across the tiled floor. The receipt printer hummed softly behind the register. The ordinary world carried on, completely unaware that something extraordinary had just happened. Evelyn looked at Alessandro with the same calm expression she had worn all afternoon. Then, in effortless Sicilian Italian, she answered, "I understood enough." Her pronunciation was flawless, not merely correct, native. The subtle rhythm of Western Sicily flowed naturally through every syllable, the kind of accent learned only through years of disciplined study or a lifetime of immersion. Matteo's eyes widened almost imperceptibly. Alessandro's hand froze halfway toward the shopping bag. For the first time since entering the store, he looked directly at Evelyn. Not at her uniform, not at her name tag. At her. "You speak Sicilian?" he asked, still in Italian. Evelyn nodded politely. "I speak several regional dialects." There was no pride in her voice, only a simple statement of fact. Alessandro studied her for a moment, curiosity replacing amusement. "Interesting." He smiled faintly. "Then perhaps you also understood my unfortunate joke." "I did." A brief silence followed. "I hope you weren't offended." Evelyn gave a small shrug. "I've learned that people often reveal more about themselves than about the person they're judging." The answer caught Alessandro slightly off guard. He had expected irritation, embarrassment, perhaps an angry response. Instead, she had answered with quiet composure. There was no accusation in her voice, no attempt to shame him. Only honesty. Something about that unsettled him far more than outrage would have. He inclined his head slightly. "Then allow me to apologize." "Thank you," Evelyn replied. "I appreciate that." The conversation could have ended there. Perhaps it should have. Alessandro picked up one of the shopping bags. Matteo reached for the second. Evelyn almost wished them a pleasant afternoon. Instead, a familiar instinct stopped her. The same instinct that had once made senior investigators ask her to review difficult recordings one final time before closing a case. She hesitated, only briefly. Then she spoke. "There is one more thing." Both men looked back. Evelyn chose her next words carefully. "I realize this is none of my business." "It probably isn't," Alessandro answered with a polite smile. "Still." She folded her hands gently on the counter. "I believe you should know that one sentence in your conversation wasn't repeated correctly." The smile disappeared from Matteo's face. Alessandro frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" Evelyn didn't answer immediately. Instead, she looked at Alessandro. Would you mind if I repeated your conversation? His expression became thoughtful. You remember it? I remember conversations for a living. Something in her tone carried quiet confidence rather than arrogance. Alessandro slowly nodded. Go ahead. Without hesitation, without searching for words, Evelyn repeated every sentence they had exchanged since arriving at the register. In Italian, matching Alessandro's pace, matching Matteo's responses, even preserving the brief pauses between sentences. When she reached the joke about the chubby cashier, she repeated it exactly as spoken. She made no attempt to soften it, no attempt to emphasize it. She simply quoted it, word for word. When she finished, silence settled over the checkout lane. Alessandro stared at her. For the first time in years, he couldn't remember hearing anyone reproduce an entire conversation with such astonishing precision. You remembered all of that, he said quietly. It wasn't especially difficult. She offered an apologetic smile. I've had an unusually good memory since I was a child. Matteo forced a short laugh. Very impressive. Then he turned toward Alessandro. We should probably get going. Neither of them moved. Alessandro's attention remained fixed on Evelyn. You said one sentence wasn't repeated correctly. Yes. She nodded once. You said the meeting would remain at Pier 12. She looked at Alessandro, making certain she wasn't mistaken. Those were your exact words. He answered immediately. They were. Only then did she turn toward Matteo. But the response you received mentioned Pier 14. Again, she spoke without emotion, without accusation. As someone trained in linguistic accuracy, I noticed the substitution immediately. Matteo smiled. Barely. It sounds like an innocent mistake. It could be, Evelyn agreed. People misspeak every day. She paused. But something about this didn't sound accidental. Alessandro's expression hardened. Why? Because there was no hesitation. She spoke calmly, almost as if explaining grammar to a classroom. When people accidentally misspeak, they usually correct themselves. They pause. They repeat the original information. They ask for confirmation. She looked toward Matteo. None of those things happened. You answered with complete confidence. Her words were gentle, but precise. It sounded less like remembering, and more like replacing. The checkout lane became strangely quiet. Even customers nearby seemed to sense the sudden change in atmosphere. Matteo's smile had disappeared. You've built quite a conclusion from one sentence. I haven't reached a conclusion, Evelyn answered. I've only identified an inconsistency. There was an important difference. She wasn't accusing anyone of betrayal. She wasn't claiming to understand their business. She was speaking only about language, only about what she had heard. Nothing more, nothing less. Alessandro remained silent. Inside his mind, the conversation replayed exactly as Evelyn had reconstructed it. Pier 12. Pier 14. He had missed it. Completely. Not because it had been hidden, because he had never imagined he needed to listen for deception from the man standing beside him. Trust had filled in the missing pieces before reason ever had the chance. He slowly turned toward Matteo. What location did you tell the others? The question was simple. Matteo answered just as calmly. The one we've always used. That wasn't my question. For the first time, Alessandro's voice lost its warmth. I asked, what location did you give them? Matteo held his gaze. Neither man spoke for several seconds. Evelyn immediately wished she had never opened her mouth. Whatever existed between these two men had nothing to do with her. She had merely pointed out a discrepancy. Nothing else. Quietly, she slid the receipt across the counter. I may be mistaken. She offered both men a respectful smile. If so, I sincerely apologize. Alessandro never looked away from Matteo. No, he said softly. I don't think you are. Alessandro Moretti left Maplewood Market carrying the same 2 grocery bags he had purchased every Thursday. From the outside, nothing appeared different. He thanked Evelyn with a brief nod. She wished him a pleasant afternoon. The automatic doors slid shut behind him. Customers continued shopping. Cash registers continued beeping. Within minutes, the store had returned to its ordinary rhythm. Only Evelyn knew that the conversation at Register 3 refused to leave her mind. She replayed every sentence while helping customers throughout the afternoon. Had she crossed a line? Perhaps Matteo had simply misspoken. Perhaps she had allowed old professional instincts to interfere in a situation that had nothing to do with her. By the end of her shift, she had almost convinced herself that she would never see either man again. Across town, Alessandro remained unusually quiet. Matteo noticed. "You've hardly spoken since we left the store." "I've been thinking about the cashier." Alessandro glanced through the windshield. "I'm thinking about why I failed to notice something she heard in less than 2 minutes." Matteo gave a dismissive smile. "She has an exceptional memory, that's all. Perhaps. But memory wasn't what concerned her." He paused. Precision was. For years, Alessandro had built his reputation on questioning every detail. Every contract, every alliance, every financial report. Trust, in his world, had never been given freely. It had always been verified. Yet one person had gradually become the exception. Matteo, his oldest advisor, his most dependable lieutenant, the man who had stood beside him through difficult negotiations, economic downturns, and countless business conflicts. Without realizing it, Alessandro had stopped verifying what Matteo said years ago. That realization unsettled him more than Evelyn's observation itself. Late that evening, Alessandro sat alone inside his office. Instead of reviewing investment reports, he opened a secure archive containing travel schedules, meeting arrangements, and communication logs from the past several years. He searched for one thing: changes. Not major ones. Small ones. Adjusted meeting times. Different locations. Unexpected reroutes. The kind of minor alterations most people ignored because they seemed insignificant on their own. Patterns rarely announced themselves. They accumulated quietly. Hour after hour, Alessandro compared original instructions against final arrangements. At first, nothing. Then something. A warehouse address modified by one street. A shipment redirected through another company. A meeting postponed by exactly 30 minutes without explanation. Each change appeared reasonable by itself. Together, they formed a pattern. Not random. Intentional. Someone had been making tiny adjustments that benefited unknown interests, while remaining almost impossible to detect. Alessandro leaned back in his chair. His thoughts returned to Evelyn. It sounded less like remembering and more like replacing. She had not accused anyone. She had merely described what she heard. The conclusion had been his. The following morning, Alessandro quietly ordered an internal audit. Not an investigation announced to the entire organization. Only a confidential review involving 3 people he had trusted long before Matteo entered his life. He gave no explanation, only instructions. Verify every change made to meeting locations during the last 5 years. Nothing more. 3 days passed, then 4. On the 5th evening, a sealed folder arrived on Alessandro's desk. Inside were dozens of documented inconsistencies, each one small. Each one easily dismissed in isolation. Together, they painted a deeply unsettling picture. Confidential information had consistently reached competing organizations hours before important negotiations. Business opportunities had quietly disappeared. Partnerships had unexpectedly collapsed. Financial losses that had once seemed like bad luck now looked disturbingly deliberate. Every trail eventually passed through one name: Matteo Ricci. Alessandro closed the folder. He did not feel anger. Not immediately. He felt disbelief. Years of unquestioned loyalty had begun to unravel because an ordinary cashier had noticed the difference between two numbers. Pier 12. Pier 14. Meanwhile, life at Maplewood Market changed in ways Evelyn never expected. Someone had recognized Alessandro while he visited the store. Another customer remembered hearing Evelyn answer him in Italian. Within days, the story spread across neighborhood social media. Unfortunately, the truth did not travel as quickly as speculation. Some posts praised Evelyn as brilliant. Others questioned her motives. One anonymous account claimed she had deliberately embarrassed a wealthy businessman to become famous. Another insisted she had invented the entire conversation. By the weekend, strangers who had never met Evelyn were debating her character online. She ignored nearly all of it, until reporters began appearing outside the grocery store. They waited near the entrance with cameras and microphones. "Evelyn, is it true you exposed a powerful businessman? Did you secretly record the conversation? Were you paid for the information?" Each question assumed there had been some scheme, some hidden ambition. Evelyn answered every reporter exactly the same way. "I have nothing to add." Then she walked inside and began her shift. Her co-workers were less calm. "I would have hired an agent already," one cashier joked. "You could probably make a fortune telling your story." Another employee asked why she didn't sell the interview rights to one of the television networks now calling the store every day. Evelyn smiled politely. "Because it isn't my story to sell." That answer spread almost as quickly as the rumors. It eventually reached Alessandro. He read every interview request she had declined, every offer she had refused, every attempt to profit from an event that had unexpectedly placed her in the public eye. She accepted none of them. No television appearances, no exclusive interviews, no money, no publicity. She simply continued working behind Register 3 as though nothing had happened. For the first time in many years, Alessandro found himself genuinely intrigued by someone who seemed completely uninterested in influence. Power usually attracted people. Attention changed them. Recognition tempted them. Yet Evelyn appeared to want only one thing: her ordinary life back. Sitting alone in his office, Alessandro looked once more at the investigation file. The evidence against Matteo had become impossible to ignore, but another realization occupied his thoughts. The woman he had dismissed with a careless joke had possessed every opportunity to exploit what she knew. Instead, she had chosen honesty, not for recognition, not for reward, simply because the truth mattered. Alessandro closed the folder and looked out across the city lights. For the first time in years, respect, not suspicion, occupied his thoughts. And he knew he owed Evelyn Harper something far more valuable than an apology. He owed her his trust. Nearly 3 weeks passed before Alessandro returned to Maplewood Market. For the first time since their unusual conversation, he arrived without Matteo. He also arrived without an entourage. No assistants, no advisors, no expensive suit that announced his status before he spoke. Instead, he wore a dark wool sweater beneath a simple jacket, looking less like one of the East Coast's most influential businessmen and more like an ordinary customer stopping by after work. Almost. There was still something about him that made people instinctively step aside without knowing why. Evelyn noticed him the moment he entered the store, not because she had been waiting, because people rarely forgot faces attached to extraordinary moments. She greeted him exactly as she greeted everyone else. "Good afternoon. Welcome back." Alessandro smiled. "Good afternoon, Evelyn." It was the first time he had used her name. He picked up his usual items before joining the shortest checkout line. When he reached Register 3, neither of them mentioned what had happened weeks earlier. Instead, Evelyn scanned the groceries with practiced efficiency. "The coffee you usually buy was on sale today. I noticed. You saved almost $12. A faint smile crossed Alessandro's face. "I suspect I'm one of the few people here who didn't need to save $12. "Perhaps." She placed the coffee carefully into the shopping bag. "But everyone enjoys a good bargain." For reasons he couldn't quite explain, Alessandro laughed. It wasn't loud. It wasn't loud. It wasn't rehearsed. It was genuine. The sound surprised him almost as much as it surprised Evelyn. "You have an unusual way of looking at the world," he admitted. "My grandmother would say I simply pay attention." There it was again. That quiet reference to the woman who had shaped her life. Alessandro remembered the background report his investigators had prepared after the internal audit. He had not ordered it out of suspicion. He had wanted to understand the woman whose honesty had altered the course of his own life. The report contained no scandals, no hidden wealth, no secret ambitions, only an academic career filled with remarkable achievements. Advanced degrees, government language contracts, professional commendations. Then, without warning, everything stopped. The next 3 years contained almost nothing except medical appointments connected to one elderly woman. Her grandmother. Evelyn had walked away from an extraordinary career without complaint, publicity, or regret. Few people willingly surrendered success. Even fewer did so for someone who could never repay them. As she handed him the receipt, Alessandro spoke quietly. "The investigation is finished." She looked up. "I'm glad you found your answers." "We did." He paused. "And you were correct." Evelyn lowered her eyes for a moment. "I wasn't trying to be correct. I know. I only noticed a difference. That difference changed everything." She remained silent. There was nothing appropriate to say. Alessandro reached into his coat pocket and placed a sealed envelope on the counter. "I'd like you to accept this." Evelyn didn't touch it. "What is it?" "A gesture of gratitude." "I don't need to know the amount." "You should." "I don't." Her answer came so naturally that Alessandro almost smiled again. "Evelyn, you helped save years of work. You protected people you'll never meet. You deserve to be recognized." She gently pushed the envelope back toward him. "I already have been." He looked confused. "You apologized." She smiled softly. "Most people never do." For several seconds, Alessandro simply looked at her. He had negotiated with billionaires. He had persuaded politicians. He had convinced international executives to change decisions worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Yet this quiet woman behind a grocery register had just refused him with complete kindness. Not because she wanted more, because she genuinely expected nothing. "You really don't want it?" She shook her head. "My grandmother used to tell me that gratitude loses something when it comes with a price tag. And if I insist, then I'll donate it to the nursing home that cared for her during her final weeks." Again, no hesitation, no calculation, only conviction. Alessandro slowly picked up the envelope. For the first time in many years, money had completely failed as a solution. Oddly enough, he found that refreshing. Just then, an elderly customer approached the register with a walking cane and an overloaded shopping basket. Without thinking, Evelyn excused herself. "One moment." She walked around the counter and helped the gentleman transfer his groceries onto the conveyor belt. She noticed one of the soup cans had expired and quietly replaced it with a fresh one from a nearby display. She searched her pocket for a store coupon the man had forgotten to use. When he apologized for taking so much time, she answered with the same warmth she always carried. "You've spent your whole life taking care of other people. Please, let us take care of you for 5 minutes." The man's eyes became slightly misty. "You're a very kind young lady." After he left, Alessandro realized he had been watching the entire exchange, not because it was extraordinary, Because it wasn't. No cameras were present. No reporters waited outside. No influential people stood nearby. Evelyn behaved exactly the same when nobody important was watching. Character, Alessandro realized, was simply consistency without an audience. As he gathered his shopping bags, he asked one final question. "Would you allow me to buy you dinner sometime?" There was no arrogance in the invitation, no assumption that she would accept, only quiet sincerity. Evelyn considered the question carefully before answering. "I appreciate the invitation." She smiled apologetically. "But I think it would be better if we became acquaintances before trying to become anything else." Most men of Alessandro's influence had probably never heard such an answer. He accepted it without disappointment. In that case, he offered a respectful nod. "I'll start by becoming a regular customer." "You already are." "I suppose I mean a different kind of regular." This time, Evelyn laughed. The sound was light and genuine. "So long as you promise not to make fun of the cashier in Italian anymore." Alessandro rubbed the back of his neck with unmistakable embarrassment. "I think I've learned that lesson." "I certainly hope so." As he walked toward the exit, Alessandro realized something unexpected. For weeks, he had believed Evelyn had earned his admiration because she uncovered a betrayal. Now he understood the truth. That moment had only introduced her. The real reason he admired her was much simpler. She treated every person, from wealthy executives to lonely retirees, with exactly the same quiet dignity. And that, he realized, was a kind of strength no empire could ever purchase. Outside, the afternoon sun stretched long shadows across the parking lot. For the first time in years, Alessandro found himself looking forward to next Thursday. Not because of business, but because there was a conversation waiting for him with a woman who had never once cared about his power, only his character. 3 months after an ordinary Thursday at Maplewood Market, the city's most influential business leaders gathered inside the grand ballroom of the Harrington Hotel. The annual East Coast Commerce Summit had always been an invitation-only event. Corporate executives, investment bankers, international attorneys, shipping magnates, political advisors. From the outside, it was simply another prestigious business conference. Those familiar with the city's hidden networks understood it served another purpose as well. Major alliances were quietly strengthened there. Disputes were settled behind closed doors. Reputations were made, or quietly dismantled. For the first time in years, Alessandro Moretti arrived without Matteo at his side. People noticed. No one asked why. Rumors had already spread throughout every influential circle on the East Coast. Some believed Matteo had retired unexpectedly. Others whispered about internal disagreements. A few insisted Alessandro had become paranoid after listening to a grocery store cashier. That last rumor amused more people than anyone cared to admit. Inside the ballroom, conversations paused briefly as Alessandro entered. He acknowledged familiar faces with polite nods before taking his place near the front of the room. Across the hall, Evelyn Harper quietly adjusted the sleeve of her navy blue blazer. She still felt slightly out of place. When Alessandro had invited her to attend as a guest several weeks earlier, her first instinct had been to decline. "I don't belong in rooms like that," she had told him. His answer had stayed with her. "You belong in any room where honesty matters." She had accepted only after he promised she would not be expected to speak. She was simply there to observe, nothing more. Even so, she attracted curious glances almost immediately. Several guests recognized her from newspaper articles and television reports. Whispers drifted across the ballroom. "That's the cashier, the translator. The woman who supposedly uncovered everything. I heard she manipulated the investigation. I heard she's looking for a book deal." Evelyn pretended not to hear. Months of unwanted attention had taught her an important lesson. People often preferred interesting stories over accurate ones. Across the room, Alessandro noticed the conversations surrounding her. He also noticed something else. Despite the speculation, despite the sideways glances, Evelyn greeted every server who refilled her water with the same warm smile she had once offered customers buying groceries. Nothing about her had changed. That quiet consistency strengthened his conviction more than any investigation ever could. The summit officially began. A series of speakers discussed international trade, shipping regulations, and investment forecasts. Everything proceeded exactly as planned, until the final session. One of Matteo's longtime associates stood to address the audience. His expression remained calm, his words carefully measured. "Before we conclude today's meeting," he began, "I believe an important misunderstanding deserves clarification." The room grew quieter. He continued, "Recent events have damaged the reputation of respected professionals based largely on the observations of someone with no connection to our industry." Several people nodded. Others exchanged curious glances. The speaker looked toward Evelyn. No formal investigative experience, no involvement in logistics, no executive responsibility. And yet, we're expected to believe she uncovered a deception that experienced professionals somehow failed to notice. A faint murmur spread across the ballroom. Evelyn lowered her eyes. She had expected criticism. She simply hadn't expected it in a room full of strangers. The speaker smiled politely. "I mean no personal disrespect. But perhaps we've given extraordinary credibility to an extraordinary coincidence." Several guests quietly applauded, not enthusiastically, just enough to suggest agreement. Evelyn drew a slow breath. She had no intention of responding. She had promised Alessandro she would remain a guest, nothing more. Before she could even consider standing, Alessandro rose. The applause stopped immediately. He walked toward the center of the room with the calm confidence that had earned him respect long before anyone knew his name. When he spoke, his voice remained steady. "The gentleman is correct about one thing." Every eye turned toward him. "Evelyn Harper did not conduct our investigation." A few people exchanged satisfied smiles. Alessandro continued, "My investigators did." He nodded toward a large screen behind the stage. Everything they reviewed was independently verified. A technician activated the presentation. The screen displayed a detailed timeline, meeting records, communication logs, location changes, verified financial documents. Nothing sensational, only facts. Each slide demonstrated another small alteration made over several years. Standing alone, every change appeared harmless. Viewed together, the pattern became impossible to dismiss. The audience grew noticeably quieter. Alessandro spoke again. The first inconsistency was identified at a grocery store. He looked toward Evelyn. Not because she knew our business, because she respected language. Another slide appeared. Two nearly identical sentences. Pier 12, Pier 14. One word. One number. One substitution. The difference that had begun everything. Alessandro explained how the investigation expanded from that single observation until independent evidence confirmed years of deliberate manipulation. No speculation, no accusations, only documented findings. When the final slide disappeared, silence filled the ballroom. The man who had questioned Evelyn no longer spoke. He simply looked down at the floor. After several moments, Alessandro turned away from the screen. He faced the audience. Then he faced Evelyn. Months earlier, he had stood across a grocery checkout counter, believing she was someone too ordinary to notice. Now, surrounded by the city's most powerful people, he understood how profoundly mistaken he had been. His next words carried through the silent ballroom. "I underestimated this woman." No one moved. "I believed appearances told me everything I needed to know." He smiled faintly, almost at himself. I've negotiated billion-dollar agreements. I've built organizations. I've spent my life evaluating people." He paused, and I nearly ignored the smartest person in the room because I assumed an ordinary cashier couldn't possibly notice what I had missed. Evelyn felt every eye turn toward her. She wished they wouldn't. Recognition had never been comfortable. Alessandro slowly walked toward her. When he stopped a few feet away, he did something no one present had ever seen him do. He inclined his head in a quiet gesture of respect. Not exaggerated, not theatrical, simply sincere. "You earned my respect long before you earned my trust." He smiled warmly. "And if you'll allow me to say so, perhaps one day you'll earn something even more valuable." A soft ripple of knowing laughter moved through the audience. Evelyn couldn't help smiling. "You still plan your conversations too far in advance." The room laughed with her. Even Alessandro. It was the first time many of those present had ever seen him laugh without restraint. One elderly executive near the front of the room began applauding. Another joined him, then another. Within seconds, the applause spread across the ballroom. Not loud, not forced. Respectful, genuine. No one was applauding a powerful businessman. They were applauding a woman who had never asked for recognition, and whose integrity had earned it anyway. As the applause continued, Evelyn looked around the room. Just months earlier, strangers had dismissed her because of her appearance. Today, the same kinds of people stood, not because she had become powerful, but because she had quietly remained herself. And in that moment, she realized something her grandmother had known all along. Character eventually speaks loudly enough that the world has no choice but to listen. 6 months later, Thursday afternoons still held a special place in Evelyn Harper's heart. Only now, she experienced them from a very different office. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the city's harbor, where cargo ships drifted in and out beneath the afternoon sun. Shelves lined one wall, filled not with financial awards or expensive decorations, but with dictionaries, linguistic journals, and books on international history collected over a lifetime. A framed photograph of her grandmother occupied the center of her desk. It was the only decoration Evelyn had insisted on bringing. Everything else in the office had been Alessandro's idea. The title on her door no longer read cashier. It simply read Director of International Communications. The position had surprised nearly everyone. Many outsiders assumed Alessandro had created it out of gratitude. Those who worked closely with them knew better. He had created the position because no one else possessed Evelyn's unique combination of linguistic precision, emotional intelligence, and absolute integrity. Her responsibilities extended far beyond translation. She reviewed sensitive international correspondence before major negotiations. She advised executives on cultural misunderstandings that could quietly damage partnerships. She often detected problems long before anyone else noticed them, not because she searched for mistakes, but because she listened more carefully than most people ever learned to do. Several months into her new role, one senior executive smiled after a successful negotiation. "I spent 20 years studying international business," he admitted. "You solved the problem because one adjective sounded slightly too formal." Evelyn laughed softly. "Sometimes relationships change because of one word." The executive nodded. "I'll never underestimate one word again." Neither would Alessandro. He had become one of the first people to seek Evelyn's opinion before making important decisions. Not because she always agreed with him. Quite the opposite. She challenged assumptions respectfully. She questioned details others overlooked. She reminded him that confidence and certainty were not always the same thing. He discovered that disagreement offered with kindness was far more valuable than agreement offered out of fear. Their friendship developed quietly. There were no dramatic declarations, no grand romantic gestures, no whirlwind romance. Instead, There were conversations over coffee after long meetings, walks through quiet parks on Sunday mornings, book recommendations exchanged across his desk, friendly debates about history, language, and travel. Every Thursday, without fail, Alessandro still brought Evelyn a small bar of dark chocolate. "The same brand?" she teased one afternoon. "I'm a man of tradition, or habit. There isn't always a difference." She smiled. There usually is. He never managed to win those arguments. He secretly enjoyed losing them. One evening, they returned to Maplewood Market together, not for publicity, not for nostalgia, simply because Evelyn wanted to thank the people who had worked beside her for nearly 4 years. Nothing inside the store had changed. The familiar scent of fresh bread still drifted through the entrance. Shopping carts still rattled across the polished floor. Register 3 remained exactly where she had left it. Only this time, someone else stood behind it. Her former co-workers greeted her with enthusiastic hugs. Even the manager, who had once worried she was overqualified for the job, smiled proudly. "We always knew you'd do something incredible," Evelyn laughed. "You also complained when I alphabetized the break room." "We miss that too." As they talked, an elderly gentleman slowly approached the checkout line, carrying a basket of peaches. Evelyn recognized him immediately. "So does my wife," he said warmly. She blinked. "The peaches," he smiled. "You always packed them carefully." For a moment, neither of them mentioned her new position. Neither spoke about newspaper articles or business conferences. To him, she was still the kind cashier who remembered that peaches bruised easily. Oddly enough, that meant more to Evelyn than every newspaper headline combined. As they prepared to leave, a young customer whispered to her friend, just loudly enough to be overheard, "Isn't that the woman everyone keeps talking about?" The friend glanced toward Evelyn. "I thought she'd look different." Evelyn smiled to herself. Some expectations never changed. Outside, Alessandro opened the passenger door of the car before walking around to the driver's side. "You know," he said, as they pulled away from the parking lot, "I used to believe influence belonged to the loudest person in the room. And now, I think it belongs to the person people trust when the room becomes quiet." Evelyn looked out the window. "My grandmother would have liked that. I wish I'd met her." "So do I." A comfortable silence settled between them. Months later, during another international conference, a newly appointed executive quietly asked Alessandro about the woman reviewing multilingual briefing documents at the far end of the table. "I've heard she's brilliant." Alessandro looked toward Evelyn. She was listening patiently while representatives from 3 different countries discussed a complicated agreement. Occasionally, she interrupted, not to correct grammar, but to clarify meaning before misunderstanding became conflict. The room trusted her. Not because of her title, because she had earned that trust, one conversation at a time. The executive lowered his voice. "I'll admit, I expected someone different." Alessandro smiled knowingly. "So did I." The executive followed his gaze. "What changed your mind?" Alessandro chuckled quietly. "The biggest mistake of my career." He remembered an ordinary Thursday. A neighborhood grocery store. A careless joke spoken in Italian. A woman everyone else had overlooked. "I once judged her by appearances." He shook his head. "I've never repeated that mistake." The executive waited. Alessandro's smile widened. "Be careful." The last man who underestimated Evelyn Harper lost everything that mattered. Across the room, Evelyn looked up from her documents. Perhaps she had sensed someone watching. Perhaps she simply knew him well enough by then. She raised one eyebrow playfully. "In case you're telling stories about me." She switched effortlessly into Italian. "Your Sicilian accent still needs work." Several international delegates laughed. Alessandro placed a hand over his heart, with exaggerated offense. "I've been practicing. I know. It still needs work. This time, they both laughed. Not because either of them remembered the insult that had first brought them together, but because it no longer mattered. What remained was something far stronger than first impressions. Respect that had been earned, trust that had been tested, affection that had grown patiently over time. As the meeting continued, Alessandro glanced once more toward the woman everyone had once overlooked. The smartest person in the room had never needed to prove it. She had simply remained true to herself until everyone else finally noticed. And perhaps that was the greatest victory of all.